it has to be said that Brexit hasn't exactly helped matters for those coming through at the moment who have an interest in the EU and in EU law. Because before Brexit, I would of course have said, listen, my friends, the door is wide open. Your qualifications will be recognized. You have free movement rights, just go out there and have fun. And sadly, post-Brexit, there are a number of doors which are not open. For example, working inside the EU institutions, there is a requirement that you be an EU national. So if somebody is lucky enough to have dual nationality, as I now do, or perhaps, they have UK and Irish nationality, or they have the passport through their mother of another member state, yes, that door is still open, but for a person who only has British nationality, that door is not open. That doesn't mean that it's no longer interesting and important and indeed very rewarding to think that you might want to do something with EU law. And I deliberately leave to one side the whole big political question of whether at some stage the UK may decide that it would like to change the present situation in its relationship with the EU and perhaps have a closer relationship, or perhaps join the European Economic Area, or perhaps rejoin the EU. I'm putting all of that to one side. And I'm approaching it from the other end, and I'm saying, look, nobody has changed the geography of Europe. The geography of Europe is that we have an offshore island called the United Kingdom, which is off the coast of the continent of Europe, with an EU member state, the Republic of Ireland, to one side of it, and indeed with a land border with the EU in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The geography hasn't changed. If and to the extent that as a lawyer, you go into practice, it is extraordinarily likely that somewhere or other you're going to fall over EU law when advising a client, because the client is going to have dealings with the EU. The client is going to be exporting. The client is going to have a customer. There's going to be an issue that arises. And so the ability to read EU law and understand it, to understand how it's written, to understand how the judgments of the court are written and how to read them, and how to read the Advocate General's opinion, all of that is going to continue to be relevant. And it's also going to be continue to be relevant because there is such a thing as retained EU law in the UK legal system, because a snapshot was taken and vast amounts of law simply were imported into the UK legal system. And with that imported law came obviously the drafting style and came the supporting case law. I know there's a discussion going on about retained EU law. Actually, some of that discussion is, with greatest respect to Lord Frost, based on a misunderstanding. All countries have rules. All countries have regulations. If you don't have the regulations that originated with the EU, then there are other regulations. A regulation-free universe is not, frankly, what's going to happen with business in the 21st century. And a lot of business does not want to have two different sets of rules that they have to comply with, because if there are two different sets of rules, then there are additional costs. So my practitioner's instinct, if you like, tells me that there's going to be a lot of retained EU law, which is still knocking around inside the English legal system in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years' time. And if and to the extent it's been a little altered around the edges, it's going to be even more important to be able to understand the EU law behind it, and then to try to read it and understand whether it's still EU law or whether it's altered. In other words, technically, the job for the lawyer advising will not become a job which doesn't need EU law. It will still need EU law. It's just it will become a more difficult job. I have to say, I think whatever else Brexit has done, I don't think it will have deprived lawyers of jobs. I think on the contrary, there's going to be enough legal work out there on matters related to EU law, to withdrawal agreement, to the trade and cooperation agreement, to whatever other agreements are floating around, to retained EU law. I really think there's going to be quite enough out there to keep everyone very busy and gainfully employed. I'm going to add an academic footnote, which is also that reading and understanding EU law gives you an insight into comparative law, and it also gives you an insight into how a federal legal system works, in the sense that you have EU law and you have the member states and you have the interaction between those. And having an understanding of comparative law and having an understanding of federal law, think the US, both of those are very useful intellectual aspects of being a good lawyer. So you may wonder a little, do I really still have to do EU law as one of my subjects now that the UK has left the EU? My answer to that would be absolutely you do. And that's not just for historical interest. That is spoken as a practitioner with an eye to giving good advice to the client and giving non-negligent advice to the client, because don't forget that as a practitioner, you always do have to make sure that what you are doing is advising properly and adequately, and that you do not inadvertently overlook something that you ought to have looked at.